In the high desert of southwestern Colorado, beneath one of the most photographed ruins in North America, there is an emptiness that should not exist. Not a cave, not a crack widened by 10,000 years of water. A chamber, measured and deliberate, sealed deep under solid stone. For a century, scientists believed Mesa Verde had given up every secret it held. Then a routine scan returned voids, regular, spaced, connected. And when a machine with no career to protect read the data, it did not describe collapse, it described a structure, and it was not looking for a mystery. To understand why this matters, we have to go back to what we thought we knew. The people we now call the ancestral Puebloans lived across the Four Corners region, where Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, for well over 1,000 years. They were not wanderers. They were farmers, patient ones, coaxing corn and beans and squash out of thin soil on a high, cold plateau where the growing season is short and the rain is never guaranteed. They read the land the way we read instruments. They stored water where they could. They watched the sky, and they timed their planting to the movement of the sun, because on that mesa, a mistake of 2 weeks was the difference between a full granary and a hungry winter. For centuries they lived on the open mesa tops in scattered villages, in pit houses dug shallowly into the earth. And then, sometime around the year 1200, for reasons scholars still argue about, they did something dramatic. They moved. They came down off the open land and built into the cliffs themselves, into the great sheltered alcoves that erosion had carved into the canyon walls over millions of years. And there they raised the structures the world knows today. Cliff Palace, with its rows of stacked rooms and its round ceremonial chambers, a whole town folded into a single sweep of stone. Balcony House, reached by ladders up a sheer wall, its entrance designed so that no one could approach it unseen. Spruce Tree House, tucked so neatly into its alcove that from a distance it seems to grow out of the rock rather than to have been built against it. Hundreds of rooms, whole communities, all of it wedged into ledges that a modern building inspector would not certify for a staircase. And the official account of these people is a good one. It deserves to be told plainly because much of it is almost certainly true. They were masons of extraordinary skill, fitting sandstone blocks with mud mortar so tightly that the walls still stand after 7 centuries of frost and wind. They were astronomers of a practical kind, aligning certain windows and towers to catch the light of the solstice, marking the turning points of the year in architecture. They were engineers who raised multi-story dwellings on shelves of rock barely wide enough to stand on, and who did it without metal tools, without the wheel, without anything but their hands and their knowledge and their patience. And then, within the span of perhaps 2 generations, they left. Near the end of the 13th century, all of them, every family, every village, walked away from the cliff palaces they had laboured to build, and they never came back. The stone rooms stood empty, the doorways faced out over canyons that grew quiet, and the wind moved through those rooms for 700 years before anyone seriously tried to understand why. The textbook explanation is drought. A great one, decades long, reconstructed from the tree rings of the region, from the narrow, starved bands of growth that mark the years when the rain did not come. Crops failed, springs dwindled, and a people who had survived by reading the land finally read a sentence they could not survive, and they moved south, toward the river valleys, toward water. Their descendants live in the pueblos of the southwest to this day. The people did not vanish from the earth. Only the canyons emptied, and the stone was left to the ravens and the frost. That is the story. It has been told in classrooms, on trail plaques, in 1,000 documentaries, and for the visible ruins, it holds. The pottery, the granaries, the hand and toe holds worn into the rock, all of it fits the account of a farming people adapting, thriving, and finally leaving. Nobody is asking you to throw that story away. But there is something inside that story that we have never taken quite seriously enough. Because the ancestral Puebloans dug. This is not in dispute. At the heart of every settlement they built sat the kiva, a round subterranean ceremonial chamber, sunk into the earth by hand, lined with masonry, roofed with timber, entered from above through a hole in the ceiling. To step into a kiva was to leave the daylight world deliberately, to descend. And at the floor of many kivas there is a small round pit, carefully made, called a sipapu. The sipapu is not decoration. In the traditions of the Pueblo peoples, it represents the opening through which humanity first emerged from the world below. It is a doorway rendered in miniature, a symbolic passage to the place their oldest stories say the people came from. The kiva itself is a statement in stone and shadow. The world beneath our feet is not empty. It is where we began. It matters. Think about what that means. The people who built Mesa Verde encoded in the deepest and most guarded chamber of their most sacred architecture the belief in a literal underground world, and they mark the exact spot on the floor where the passage to it lay. For more than 100 years, archaeology treated that as metaphor, a beautiful piece of theology, a sacred story, a spiritual architecture, not a physical one. The sipapu was a symbol, the scholars said, not a doorway, and that interpretation was reasonable. It was careful, it was exactly what a responsible discipline should conclude in the absence of evidence. But here is the problem, and it is a specific problem, and it lives underground. The official story of Mesa Verde accounts for everything we can see. The rooms, the towers, the granaries, the departure. What it has never had to account for is anything beneath the deepest kiva, because for a century we assumed there was nothing down there but solid rock. No one drilled, no one dug, no one looked, because the story was complete, and complete stories do not invite shovels. Most people assume that a site this famous, this photographed, this protected, was mapped to the bedrock long ago. That assumption sat undisturbed for 100 years, comfortable as the dust in an empty room. It was wrong. The mesa was never asked the one question that mattered. What is under the floor of the world you built? No instrument had ever been sent down to find out. Not seriously, not deep. The belief was dismissed as poetry, and the ground below it was dismissed as stone, and both dismissals rested on nothing but habit. And then the scans came back. The survey that started all of this was not searching for anything hidden. It was routine, the kind of preservation work done at old sites every few years, meant to check the stability of the cliffs and the ground behind them, to map where ancient timbers had rotted and where the rock might one day fail. Technicians walked the mesa above the great dwellings, dragging instruments that send pulses of energy down into the earth and listen for what bounces back. It is slow, unglamorous work. Solid rock returns one kind of echo, a buried wall returns another, and a void, an empty space where there should be stone, returns something unmistakable, a shape that seems to hang in the data like a held breath. They expected the usual: old fill, collapsed rooms, the natural fractures that run through sandstone the way veins run through a hand. And in the shallow layers, that is exactly what they found. But the instruments did not stop reading at the shallow layers. And deep below the level of the deepest known kiva, deeper than any grave or storage pit ever documented at the site, the returns changed. There was a pattern down there. Straight lines, right angles, spaces that repeated at even intervals, as though something beneath the mesa had been laid out to a plan. The readings were noisy, the way all such readings are, and no one wanted to say too much too soon. Careers have ended on less, so they did the careful thing. They gathered every scan, every pass, every raw file from the survey, and they handed the whole of it to an analytical system, the kind of artificial intelligence now used to sift signal from noise in data too large and too tangled for any one person to hold in their head at once. And here is the part that matters. They did not tell it what they hoped to find. They did not prime it with the story of the vanishing people, or the metaphor of the sipapu, or the assumption that nothing lay below. They gave it the numbers and one instruction: reconstruct the geometry of whatever is down there, and report it exactly as it appears. No preconception, no agenda, no reputation to defend if the answer turned out to be strange. And the answer was strange, because the first thing the system returned was not a chamber, or a cluster of collapsed rooms, or anything the archaeology of this plateau had a word for. It was a corridor. Not a natural fissure, not a crack widened by water over 10,000 years, but a passage of consistent width, its floor level to within a few centimetres over a run of more than 40 metres. Its walls ran parallel in a way that stone does not fracture on its own. The system flagged it with a plain notation: linear void, artificial probability high. And then it kept reading. Because the corridor did not end, it bent, not randomly, but at a clean angle, the kind of turn a builder makes on purpose, and it continued deeper, sloping gently downward, away from the light, toward the heart of the mesa. Sit with that for a moment. Everything we know at Mesa Verde was built up and out, into the alcoves, into the open air. Every room, every tower, every doorway was made to be seen, to be lived in daylight under the overhang of the rock. This corridor was the opposite of all of it. It ran down and in. It was made to go beneath the world that people knew, into the dark that the sipapu only pointed at. And the machine, which had never heard the word sipapu, which knew nothing of emergent stories or sacred pits, had traced a real physical throat descending into the earth exactly where those stories said the doorway to the world below should be. The technicians did what careful people do when a result unsettles them. They distrusted it. They tried to make it go away. They walked the mesa a second time in a different pattern, with the instruments recalibrated, on a day when the ground was drier and the readings cleaner. They fed the new data in cold alongside the old and asked the system to compare. It did not waver. The corridor was still there. The angle of the bend matched to within a fraction of a degree. The downward slope held. Whatever the instruments were reading, they were reading the same object twice from two independent passes and returning the same shape both times. That is the signature of something real. Noise does not repeat itself. Ghosts in the data do not hold their geometry across separate surveys. Walls do, so they brought in an outside expert, an engineer who spends his working life reading subsurface returns for tunnels and foundations and dams, a man with no stake in archaeology at all. They showed him the reconstruction. He studied it for a long time, and what he said has stayed with everyone who heard it. This, he said, is not how sandstone fails. Sandstone fails in curves, in irregular collapse, in the ragged geometry of gravity and water working patiently over centuries. What was in the scan had corners, and a natural void does not put a right angle where it wants one. Someone does. The probability that this arrangement of straight segments, consistent widths, and repeating intervals had formed by natural processes, he estimated, was vanishingly small, less than one chance in several million if you were being generous to chance. His exact phrasing was blunter. It doesn't happen, he said. Not like this, not by accident. So now we have to hold two facts at once and neither one will let go of the other. The first is that the people who built Mesa Verde told us, in the deepest and most guarded chamber of their most sacred structure, that they came from beneath the earth, and they marked the place where that passage lay. For 100 years we treated that as a story. The second fact is that a machine with no interest in stories, no knowledge of the theology, and nothing to gain from confirming it, followed the numbers straight down into the rock and found a passage exactly where the story said one would be. Those two facts are not supposed to line up, and they line up perfectly. Most people assume that a place as famous as Mesa Verde surrendered its last secrets generations ago, that after a century of digging and mapping and dissertations, nothing down there remains unseen. That assumption is the only reason this corridor sat beneath everyone's feet for so long, and what the analysis found next is why that assumption cannot survive. If you want to follow where this goes, and it goes much deeper than one corridor, subscribe now, because this is the point where it stops being a curiosity. This is where the ground beneath Mesa Verde stops making sense, because the corridor was only the beginning. When the system finished tracing that first descending passage, it did not stop at the point where the readings grew faint. It extrapolated, carefully flagging its own uncertainty, and then it turned its attention to the fainter echoes farther out. The ones the technicians had dismissed as interference, the low, noisy layer of data everyone had thrown away. And in that layer, deeper still, it found chambers. Not one, a sequence of them, arranged along the axis the corridor was pointing toward, each separated from the next by roughly the same interval, like beads strung on a line. The spacing was regular. The system measured it and reported the variation. The distance between chambers held consistent to within about 3% across the entire run. 3%, over a span of underground space longer than a football field, buried beneath solid rock. Something had been laid out with a rhythm so even that it barely drifted. Think about what that regularity implies. Rooms that happen by collapse or erosion have no rhythm at all. They cluster where the rock is weak and vanish where it is strong. Their spacing is the spacing of chance, but these chambers were evenly spaced, as if measured out, as if whoever made them had a unit of distance in mind and repeated it again and again, moving deeper into the dark. That is not the fingerprint of geology, it is the fingerprint of intention. An intention this far below the deepest kiva, in ground we were certain was solid stone, is not something the official story of Mesa Verde has any room for. So the analysts did the only honest thing. They stopped telling the machine what to expect. Up to this point, the software had been running with a purpose, looking for voids, for the shapes of known Puebloan architecture, for the things archaeologists already understood. Now they cleared all of it. They fed the raw survey back in, every pulse and echo from the entire ridge, and they gave the system no instructions at all. No target, no template, no assumption about who had lived here or how deep human activity could possibly reach. They simply asked it to report any structure that did not match the surrounding geology. Anything ordered, anything repeated, anything that random rock and water could not produce on their own. An instrument with no career riding on the answer, no tenure to protect, no century of settled scholarship it might embarrass, just patterns against noise, order against chance. What came back took the team the better part of a week to accept. The corridor and its string of chambers were real, the system confirmed. But they were not alone. Threaded through that same discarded layer of data, the machine identified more geometry. Shafts running vertically, connecting the horizontal run of chambers to levels above and below, junctions where passages met and met at angles that repeated across the whole structure. Not random branchings, the same angle, chosen and reused, the way a builder reuses a favoured measurement. And then came the finding that stopped the room cold. When the system measured those repeated angles and compared them against one another, it reported that they clustered tightly around a single value, and it put a number on how tightly. The probability that this degree of angular consistency arose by natural processes alone, it estimated, was less than 1 in 4 million. 1 in 4 million. Sit with that number, because it is the hinge on which everything after it turns. It does not prove who, it does not prove when. What it does is close the door marked coincidence. Below a certain threshold, chance stops being a serious explanation, and 4 million to 1 is far below that threshold. Whatever is under this ridge was not shaped by water finding the path of least resistance through soft stone. It was laid out by something that understood angles and repeated them on purpose, deeper than we have ever thought to look on this plateau. The team went further. They brought in a structural engineer, a man who spends his career analysing load paths, the way built things hold themselves up against gravity, and they showed him the reconstructed geometry blind, without telling him where it came from or what it was supposed to be. He studied the repeated angles, the vertical shafts, the way the chambers distributed weight along the axis, and his assessment, delivered slowly, was this. If a human engineer had been asked to design a stable void system at that depth, in that kind of rock, minimising collapse risk over a long span, this is close to what he would have drawn. This isn't random, he said. Random doesn't distribute stress. Whatever cut this understood the rock it was cutting. He did not say who, he was careful about that. But he was equally careful about the other thing. What he was looking at solved an engineering problem, and problems get solved by minds. Then the analysts cleared the machine's assumptions one more time, this time about scale. They had been treating the ridge as the boundary of the problem. Why should it be? The original survey had swept a wider area than anyone had bothered to process, and the data existed, unexamined, sitting on drives. So they let the system look past the ridge, out under the neighbouring mesas, into the tangle of canyons that fold this region into a maze of stone. The geometry did not stop at the ridge, it continued. Faint, degraded, harder to read the farther out it went, but there, the same repeated angle, the same rhythm of evenly spaced voids. The machine traced it beneath one canyon, lost it under a band of harder rock, and picked it up again on the far side, still holding to the same axis, as if the intervening stone was simply a stretch where the signal had thinned, not where the structure had ended. What had begun as a single hidden corridor was becoming, in the reconstruction, a line. A deliberate line drawn through the underworld of the plateau, running farther than any single community would seem to have needed. And when the analysts overlaid that line onto a map of the surface, one of them went very quiet. Because the line was not wandering, it was aimed. Aimed at the horizon where the sun sets at the winter solstice, the shortest day, the turning of the year. The heading held to within 2 degrees. The machine put the odds of that alignment at less than 1 in 400. On the surface, these people tracked that horizon in windows and towers. No one knew the same reckoning ran underground, in the dark, where no eye could ever see the sun at all. Someone had carved a line through solid rock to point at a light they would never witness from inside it. Sit with that for a moment. And here is where the machine found the thing that troubled the analysts most. Not because it was the strangest finding, but because it ran the wrong way through time. When they measured the corridor's precision along its length, the geometry was not uniform. Near the ridge, close beneath the great dwellings on the surface, the work was clean. The angles were true, the spacing was regular, the walls held their lines the way a drafted plan holds its lines. But the farther the structure ran out beneath the canyons, the more the precision decayed. The angles softened, The spacing grew irregular. The voids became less certain, less deliberately placed, as if the hands that made them were guessing at a rule they could no longer state. If this had been built outward from the centre, you would expect the opposite. A builder learning, improving, getting better as the work went on. Instead, the best work was at the heart, and the quality bled away toward the edges, like a signal fading from its source, which suggested, to more than one person who studied it, something quietly devastating. The outer sections were not built later by masters, they were built by inheritors, people copying a technique they no longer fully commanded, a knowledge already in decline, a skill passed down by hands that had forgotten why each measurement mattered, keeping the shape of the practice long after the understanding behind it had gone. That is the inversion that changes everything. We tell the story of civilization as a climb, from crude to refined, from simple to complex, always upward, always forward, each generation standing on the shoulders of the last. But the ground beneath Mesa Verde tells that story backward. Down there, the most sophisticated work is the oldest. The precision does not grow, it erodes. And if the technique was inherited, then it came from somewhere, from someone, from a time before the people we credit with this plateau ever climbed into these canyons. The machine had not found the beginning of something. It had found the tail end of it. The last fading practice of a knowledge whose origin lies further back than any story we tell, in the long dark before writing, before the cliff dwellings, before the names we use for the people who lived here. So ask the question the analysts would not ask out loud. What did they know that we forgot? Why bury the year underground, pointed at a dying sun, unless you feared the surface world could not be trusted to keep it? Because there was such a time. Thousands of years before these mesas were settled, the climate of this continent lurched violently, in swings that came on within a single lifetime, emptying whole landscapes, scattering whoever lived through them. A catastrophe like that does not just kill people, it breaks the chain. It takes everything a culture knows, everything it has learned about the sky and the seasons and survival, and it leaves only fragments in the hands of whoever remains. A world that had lived through that would have reasons, good ones, to write its most important truths into rock, in the deepest, most permanent place it could reach, as a message to whoever came after. The light goes down and the light returns, and here is how you will know when. That is what the alignment says, if you let it speak. Not a temple, not a tomb, a backup. The year itself, encoded in angle and distance and stone, in the one medium that could never rot, never burn, never blow away, aimed at the solstice like a finger held permanently against the calendar of the sky. And if that is what it is, then the Kivas above it are not the origin of the belief in a world below. They are the memory of it. The sipapu is not a metaphor that later generations mistook for geography. It may be geography that later generations preserved as metaphor, a doorway remembered in miniature long after the real one was sealed, and its purpose lost. We are not the first to understand the sky. We may only be the ones who forgot, and then slowly remembered and mistook the remembering for invention. The corridor is still there under the ridge, holding its silence. No one has dug to it. The scans remain scans. The people who ran the analysis have been careful with their words, careful about who they name, careful not to say the thing the geometry keeps whispering. Because to say it out loud is to admit something uncomfortable about every certainty we carry. That the ground beneath one of the most studied places on this continent held a structure we walked over for a century without seeing. That it is aimed at a sun no one inside it could ever watch. That it was built best at its heart and forgotten at its edges, which means its story starts before our stories do. They left it for us in the one language that outlasts language. Angle, distance, stone, and now, quietly, a machine that believes in nothing has begun to read it back. So what is it? A lost chamber of the people we already know, more skilled and more secretive than we ever gave them credit for? Or the last surviving fingerprint of someone older? Someone we have no name for at all, whose knowledge trickled down through generations until only the shape of it remained, copied by hands that no longer knew what they were copying? The honest answer is that no one can say yet. The scans can be checked, the geometry can be measured, but the question of who stood in that darkness with a plan in their head, that question waits below the mesa, sealed in rock, patient as it has been for centuries. Tell me honestly in the comments what you think that buried line was pointing at, and why anyone would aim it at a light they would never live to see. I read everyone, because here is the part that should keep you up tonight. The same fingerprint, the clean center, the decaying edges, the hidden alignment has started to appear the moment the machine is turned on at other sites. Different continents, different centuries, the same signature. The next data set is already being loaded in, so if you want to be here when the ground gives up its next secret, like this video and subscribe, and tell me in the comments which site you want fed into the machine next, because whatever you choose, we're going to look underneath it.